Live from SABC headquarters in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Hello and welcome to this week's first edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo, and on the show tonight,
the community have come forward giving us information, but at some stage what is killing us, people, they don't want to come forward and write statements as witnesses.
13 people have been shot, 2 killed and 11 wounded in 6 separate attacks in Westbury, Johannesburg. From the electricity crisis to grey listing to crime, leaders of the country's foremost business organizations detail their frustrations with the state's handling of some of the most burning issues of the day. We bring you a no-holds-barred roundtable discussion with Business Unity South Africa CEO Bonang Mohale, SA Business of Commerce and Industry CEO Alan Mokoki, and Black Business Council CEO Khanki Matabane. The Watchdog starts now. Violence has returned to the suburb of Westbury, west of the Johannesburg CBD. Over the past few days, 13 people have been shot, 2 killed and 11 wounded in 6 separate attacks. It's alleged the killing of a gang leader on Thursday sparked the shooting spree.
Residents here live in constant fear as gunshots ring out daily. Some are too afraid to venture from their homes or let their children play outside. Just this morning, a teenager was shot and rushed to hospital. Since Friday, 12 unlicensed firearms have been seized in Westbury.
My daughter is in matric this year, and just for her to go to school in the morning is a hassle. Now we even have to go and collect her from school. That's how bad it is. We wake up knowing that, listen, yeah, I need to take my daughter to school, but we fear. We don't even take them early. We just wait for everything to calm down. And that's not right the way we're living. We want to know why is this happening, because we have kids that's living here.
The shooting happened in broad daylight, leaving a trail of spent bullet shells on the road. Police are urging those with information to come forward.
What is happening? We are following information. The community have come forward giving us information, but at some stage what is killing us, people, they don't want to come forward and write statements as witnesses. They say they are afraid of their lives.
Police remain in the area. Balentle Mthethwa, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Joining me on the line is independent violence and crime monitor, Mary De Haas. Good evening, Mary. Thanks very much for your time. Okay, we seem to be having a problem with that line. Hopefully we're going to be able to get Mary back on the line. Now, of course, that area is renowned for these kinds of shootings. Every once in a while you hear of these kinds of incidents, and the question really one wants to put to someone like Mary is whether in fact those who are supposed to be doing something about this do in fact do what they are supposed to do. I believe we do have Mary back. Mary, I hope the line is going to hold this time around. This incident, or what has happened or has been happening there since in Westbury since Thursday, doesn't come as a surprise, does it?
Sorry, I lost you and our power went off in the middle of an electric storm. Which specific incident?
Westbury is what we're talking about, where since Thursday, 2 people have been killed, 11 have been wounded in 6 separate attacks in that area. Apparently, or it's alleged, maybe I should say, that the killing of a gang leader on Thursday is what sparked the shooting spree we've seen since then.
Look, it certainly sounds like it, because this is the way gang activities tend to work. And, I mean, they're unfortunate, very common, because gangs are a symptom of powerlessness they happen all over the world, whether it's kind of Europe or America in Harlem or South Africa, where you have kind of deprived communities and gangs are established to kind of empower young people. It gives them a sense of kind of some sort of sense of self-esteem to be part of a gang and to be kind of asserting yourself that way. That's a very broad description, but obviously in South Africa, like in most of the world, these gangs have become linked to organized crime, especially drugs. So it's a kind of worldwide phenomenon, gangs, but it has specific South African connotations because of the type of nature of the communities in which gangs are found.
Well, and given what you've just said then about this phenomenon, is it really realistic of the police? I mean, we had the station commander in the package that we've just played saying that people know what is going on, but they refuse to give written statements and become witnesses because they fear losing their lives. That is bound to happen, hasn't it? But should the police be relying only on people coming forward to give written statements for them to be able to crack these kinds of cases?
I mean, quite frankly, now I'm dealing with a man who kind of was persuaded by the police to come forward. This was done in the Eastern Cape in Kibera years ago, and he came forward, made a statement, there was a conviction, and his life been ruined. So you can understand why this happens. And often witnesses who make statements are themselves under threat, like this particular man that contacted me recently about it. But they should not be waiting for that, because this is the whole thing about the state of crime intelligence.
Yes.
Crime intelligence, and I mean, I hate to make this analogy, but just remember how efficient crime intelligence was under apartheid. Because they diverted resources to it, expertise to it, because they wanted to catch people engaged in the liberation struggle, and they did that really, they were able to do it very efficiently. Now, in South Africa today, we need to do that for the criminals, and we're not doing it because crime intelligence has virtually collapsed. It was never very good after 94. There was integration of all sorts of different homelands and, old apartheid and new recruits. It was a work in progress. And then after 2009, it just became politicized. Think of Richard Mluli, for example, and what he got away with in crime intelligence and all his friends and relatives and everything else. And that's what we're sitting with, because if we had a proper crime intelligence, which doesn't exist at the moment, they would be out there, not just at provincial, national. They'd be there in communities. They'd be picking up what the gangsters are doing. They'd be picking up where the guns were. And they would be preempting this type of thing. But, I mean, gangs, as I said, are also in KZN, for example, in deprived areas, we mustn't think gangsterism linked to poor black communities. It's right across the racial divide. And often the people, I'll give you one example. In a big area outside of SABC municipality, Maritzburg, the guy who brings the drugs in to a local dealer is a white guy. The car is known. The police don't even have to fight. It's non-racial. See, poor people engaged in, and it's an old phenomenon. It goes right back to apartheid. Apartheid used.
Okay, that line really failing us. Once again, let me thank you there, Mary. That line continues to give us problems, but thank you so much for your time, Mary. There has been load shed. We're trying to make sense, of course, of that situation that has been taking place in Westbury, west of the Johannesburg CBD, where over the past 4 days, 13 people have been shot, 2 killed and 11 wounded in 6 separate attacks. It's alleged that the killing of a gang leader on Thursday is what sparked the shooting spree. But you may have heard from the piece we played earlier, the police saying they are finding it difficult to crack these cases because people, even though they know what would have gone on, they are not keen to make statements and be witnesses for fear that that may backfire. Their lives could be at stake. We'll continue to monitor that situation. After the break, a roundtable discussion with leaders of the country's foremost business organizations. The country's business leaders aren't satisfied with the way the government has handled some of the biggest challenges facing the country right now. From the electricity crisis to grey listing to crime, to name but a few. Now, to talk about this, I'm joined in studio by Professor Bonang Mohale, who is the president of Business Unity South Africa. On the line, I have the CEO of the Black Business Council, and that's Mr. Kangi Matabane. And hopefully, very shortly, we will be joined also by Mr. Alan Mukoki, the CEO of the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, SACI. Good evening, gentlemen, to both of you, and thanks very much for your time.
Good evening, Vuyo, and good evening, Brana Mohale.
Well, let's start with a grey listing. I mean, the president writing in his newsletter this morning, Professor Mohale, saying, hey, it's not that bad, man. The decision of the Financial Action Task Force to add us to this a grey list, it's concerning, yes, but it's not that dire.
So let me first acknowledge my leader, Ntate Khanki Matabane. Number 2, to say the condition of truth is to let suffering speak. If you are the president, it's easy for you to say it's not bad. But what concerns us as organized business is the fact that it's a litany of unfulfilled promises, of lack of service delivery, of the 734 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies. On the one hand, you've got high unemployment rate, and then you've got these ordinarily not being fully appointed. SABC is the latest one. That is taking the president to court. The ESCOM board stood for 18 months without a fully functioning board, 18 months above its 3-year mandate. Only 5 of them remained. They couldn't even make a quorum, but we let them go on. Imagine by how much would have made a dent in unemployment if every single solitary one of the 734 state-owned enterprises, state-owned companies were at least treated with a heightened sense of urgency. But the NDP 2030, we had 30 years, our own plan, to look at the 11 challenges and the 9 things that we needed to do. Every expert tells you today that with only 7 years left, we are unlikely to fulfill any of these. Therefore, for me, the Financial Action Task Force is only part one of many things. Kusile, Midupi, we should have finished in 2013. 10 years later, we're not even getting half the generation capacity. Even the new multi-product pipeline between Durban and Gauteng, where probably 12 million car park is located, 35% of the economic activity is at. It was initially budgeted at 7.2 billion. It was delivered at 20 billion at double the time.
Mr. Matawane, I mean, later on in the day, after having read the president's weekly letter in the morning, I had the Minister of Finance saying pretty much the same thing, that look, we're compliant. It's just that the Financial Action Task Force doesn't, have a pass mark. It's 100% or nothing. And over the past few years, we've been trying everything in our power to be compliant. And in about 18 months, we should be compliant.
Good evening, everyone, the viewers, and Dr. Bohal and Alan. The challenge, I think, is that the country is been on a speaking mode. We talk a lot. So even when the president or the minister says we will be out of this by in 12 months or in 24 months or 36 months, the issue is that because there's a trust deficit in the country, no one is going to believe what they are saying. And then that trust deficit is caused by a lot of talk and no action. Maybe going back to what Dr. Bohal spoke about on NDP 2030. I can't remember when last did I hear the president or any other minister talking about that, because in the NDP 2030, for example, we were supposed to, if we want to deal with the unemployment, we're supposed to create 11 million jobs by 2030, and 90% of them are supposed to come from small business. But when you look at the actions taken, including the budget that was just delivered last week, there is no focus on creating jobs and small businesses. So one can ask, what is our problem statement? Because I would have thought our problem statement is job creation, which talk to unemployment and then growing the economy. So everything that we're supposed to be doing as a country, we're supposed to be saying, how is this growing the economy? How is this creating jobs? So we cannot have a country where 70%, we've got 70% youth unemployment. And I'm sure with the matric result that came last year, the figure has gone up. And that is unsustainable from a democracy point of view. So we have to ask ourselves questions to say, are we doing what we're supposed to do to also build confidence? We've got people who just walk into a mine and mine. We've got the illegal miners, we've got the construction mafias. Why can't we just get a special force to deal with these people? Because once you deal with those type of people, you are going to increase the confidence in the country. So we need to deal with the trust deficit that we have, but it's caused by inaction and too much talk. So we need to stop talking and implement as much as we can.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, last week, if one looks at listen to what the Chief Justice had to say in his report on Friday about the functioning of our court system, he laments the fact that some of the things that they have discussed and put proposals on. These proposals are sitting with the executive and they are not being acted on. And in his newsletter today, Mr. Mukoki, the president talks about how the investors are going to tighten up on investigations and prosecution. And if one goes back to the crime statistics that were released a couple of weeks ago, it was the minister and the president who was the first to admit that we are losing the war on crime. And I'm raising all these things on the back of what Mr. Matabane has just said about the fact that these things are spoken about, promises are being made, dates are set or deadlines, but very little ever happens.
Well, good evening, Dr. Mohale and Matabane and yourself, Vuyo. I think that's quite correct, and I think that we've reached the stage where we need to accept certain realities. And one of those realities, of course, is that the problem will not necessarily change given if we throw a number of definitions at it. In other words, all of us know there is a very serious problem, and the likelihood of achieving success with the current architecture and infrastructure in terms of people and systems is not necessarily working for us. And I think that we need to be honest and say, we know that people are working hard. I don't think that you'll find generally many people, even those who are sitting in cabinet or the president, where you can actually accuse them of not working, of not trying to put in an effort. The thing that we're not dealing with as South Africans is that we're not actually dealing with the real issue, which is that we don't necessarily have the ability to solve the kinds of problems that we actually have today. So we keep blaming, criticizing, cajoling people, and almost like we're trying to force them into performance. If you've worked in business as an executive in any other environment, and one of the things that you get to be taught early on is that do not put people who are weak in positions, because you are going to strain and stress the organization. In other words, you are going to stress the individual that you've given the task to, because they don't actually have the ability to do it. You are also going to stress the organization in general, and the person that person reports to also takes that strain. So you're not doing anyone a favor. So if the job that you have is a 10 job and you continuously put a person as a 5 in a 10 job, you are not actually going to get the results. So one of the things as South Africans that we do need to accept and acknowledge is that the problems have become so complex, and they're actually running away from us purely because we're not resourcing at a human resources point of view correctly. In other words, we don't necessarily think where we are now that politicians, by their very nature, due to no fault of their own, given the background of South Africa, lack of skills, lack of management talent, development and training, that they themselves would be people, if they were honest, who are equal to the task that we actually face today. So 20 years from now, we will continue to complain about the same problems. And we've made this very point very clearly. We need to have a meritorious system. We need to look at how we appoint people into positions, and we need to deal with that problem very decisively, very early, in a way that is actually permanent. We can sit here 20 years from now, as I said earlier on, we'll be complaining about exactly the same thing, because we expect that someone who does not have a skill, someone who does not have a level of experience, is actually going to show up and fix the logistics, or is going to show up and fix the crime, safety and security problem that we have. It's not actually going to work. So we need to be able to say, you are not necessarily going to get someone who plays in a D division of a high school soccer team suddenly wanting to play for Orlando Pirates, or for the wrong example, but it's not gonna work. So you need to be able to say, I'm going to find someone who is equal to the task, who can do that. And we're avoiding dealing with this issue for a reason that I'm not so sure myself why it is so. Maybe we're scared to upset people. The level of development and training and executive training that is taking place either in cabinet or high levels of senior civil service is not actually adequate, not for the task that we have at hand at this particular point in time.
But we don't have, Professor Mohale, the option of throwing our hands up in the air, and curling our lips and saying, there's nothing we can do.
You're absolutely correct. Maybe if I can give 2 more examples. The electricity crisis is a case in point. This is an issue that started in February of 2008. 15 years later, we are unable to solve this problem. Now, how believable are we if we say we are going to stop load shedding in a year, when everybody in a room from NICOM to this cabinet have been there in the first instance when it started? In 15 years, we haven't been able to, and yet we knew what needed to be done. Secondly, the reason why we put the blame on the lap of the president, it's because it is the sole prerogative of the president, not of his party, not of the top 6, to appoint his cabinet. He promised us that he will have a smaller cabinet, that he is coming up on a ticket of rooting out and defeating state capture, which took root in 2007 on the way to Polokwane, manifested in 2009. Today, as we speak, 20 out of the 30 thieves that he found in that cabinet, he's decided to reappoint them when it was his sole prerogative. As we speak, some of them are promoted to be chairpersons of parliamentary portfolio committees. These are the people that have been named in the Zondo Commission, which he inherited from his predecessor, that needed to be pulled, cajoled, orchestrated to create this commission of inquiry. And it took 4 years. at a cost of R1 billion. The first volume out of the 6 volumes is 787 pages. All those people are called out by name. Why are they not in jail? The Financial Action Task Force told us in 2019, verbally, in a meeting that we had with them. They produced a report in October of 2021. In 4 years, we belatedly, in the last 6 months, passed and enacted 2 pieces of legislation. We're saying there's still 15 that is outstanding. In fact, 8 critical ones to measure both the effectiveness and the efficiency of the measures that we have put in place. It's like saying, you know what, actually we're not too bad, because this is 20% that is outstanding. Six Sigma teaches us in leadership that even 98% is not good enough, because if it was good enough, we are accepting that out of 100 babies that are born at Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital, 2 of them are going to slip from the hands of those doctors, head first plunge to their death. We are accepting that at Tambo International Airport, 2 out of every 100 planes that land there a day, every day, they are going to overshoot the runway with a minimum of 377 passengers on board, and they'll probably perish. How can 98% be good enough? It's because we have accepted that 30% is an acceptable pass mark in our education system, which is the only means in which the majority of people, 30 million South Africans that are living below the poverty datum line, less than $1.90 per day, can really transcend social classes. Now we condemn them to another 30 years of absolute self-perpetuating vicious cycle of abject poverty.
Now, on Sona, well, I mean, we all heard this during his address, but also, I mean, he devoted quite a number of pages on Eskom, what is being done, where the problems are, and so on. And interestingly, I mean, outgoing Eskom CEO under Director's answering affidavit this past weekend, which was in response to a court case, it was an answering affidavit in response to a court case launched by the UDM and others. Andre de Ruyter says the bulk of the country's load shedding problems are beyond Eskom's scope. He continues to say that over the past 25 years, the main drivers that have led to the power crisis were outside of Eskom's control. I don't know what you make of this, Mr. Matabane.
Yes, I think in our view as the BBC, we need to let the past be the past. Director dismally failed at Eskom, so I don't think there's any advice that he can give to anyone. He had 3 years there, he had the most support that all the other previous CEOs never had, and he has failed. The issues that he's raising about crime and others, I think those ones need to be given to the law enforcement agencies to deal with them. Our role as South Africans should be to focus all our energies in solving Eskom. Eskom is solvable. I think the new board, which was going to have a performance review with Director when he resigned, it's a very solid board, and I think he ran away from being reviewed because he's a crybaby who wants attention. So we shouldn't focus on him. Let's focus on making sure that the current Eskom performs to its optimal levels, so that we can stop load shedding. Eskom at the moment is performing at what we call energy availability factor of 53%. He found it performing at around 60-something%. So we need to move it from 53% to 70% so that we can stop load shedding, and that is doable. Hence, we were one of the people who called for the state of disaster. But the state of disaster with the limitations so that people don't abuse it and start stealing state funds. But we are saying, if we then say, let's make sure that we get all the maintenance done properly, done by engineers, done by the original equipment manufacturers, we give that time, we make sure that all the equipment that needs to be bought, they are bought, we bring all the skills that need to be brought in there, we will be able to solve the ESCOM issues within the next 24 months. But again, we don't think putting another bureaucracy in the name of a Minister of Electricity is going to help us, because already we've got 2 ministers. Now we're adding another layer of a minister who's going to basically add bureaucracy. The people at ESCOM now have to consult another layer of a minister. I don't think that will solve the problem. But if all of us, we leave the data out of this and focus all our energies on solving ESCOM, load shedding will be a thing of the past very soon.
Let's just say we do that. We focus on, solving the problems of ESCOM and forget about Andre de Ruyter, Mr. Mkoki, as Mr. Matabane is saying. What do we have a chance of succeeding if, as Mr. de Ruyter is alleging, there continues to be interference? There are people who are busy wanting to help themselves, even in this new dawn. If the Sunday Times front page story is anything to go by, you've had managers overruling engineers, crippling the system even further. Do we then have a chance of succeeding?
Well, we as SACI, of course, we avoid generally commenting on individual arrivals and departures. Individuals, that's a separate issue altogether. We can't vouch for an individual, whether they'll be good or bad. Our issue has always been the system and the system challenge in terms of how the government itself, from its own template, chooses to articulate issues of how you recruit, how you select, how you retain those people that you consider to be the people who are key in performance. Of course, if there are allegations ought to be pursued in the ordinary course of business, because they are related to things to do with crime, etc., etc. But the performance issues also need to be dealt with, and in particular, we need to handle the issue around governance. We as SACI have been very consistent in asking of cabinet itself, whether the cabinet itself does have the level and the requisite level of skills, competencies and experiences to even know how to select a board, and therefore to even know how to select a CEO and how to do the performance management. So when people overreach, in other words, you give yourself a task that is much more higher than your own skill set, the likelihood of you making a mistake is always going to be very high. So it is that system that we need to look at in terms of whether it's competent, its tone, its pace, who are the people who are actually engaged in making sure when we sit down and we say we're actually going to choose the board, what criteria are we actually following? And I'll give you an example, and we talk about this in senior executive level conversations all the time. If you run an organization, for instance, that uses IQ as one of the key criteria, and there's this thing that is called the floor effect. The variance between people in an organization like that on IQ is actually going to be very small. So it's going to be a very narrow variation. And the people who are high performers are not necessarily going to come from IQ, but they may well come from the level of emotional intelligence across all the 4 levels of self-awareness, self-management, because these two, they give you self-mastery, empathy, and social skills. So now if you want to bring someone into an organization of that particular nature, which by its very nature is an ambidextrous organization that is very complex, that also happens to have wicked problems, you are not going to be able to succeed if you only bring a person by measuring that person only on IQ, but you don't know whether they've got the social skills, you don't know whether they have these elements of self-awareness, self-management, and empathy, because this is the same individual who ought to be able to go and deal with the unions at the level of the union leadership to understand very truly what the issues are that are actually facing the employees. I'm making that as an example in that it is never particularly clear to us when we look at government, whether it's a cabinet committee, whether it's a minister, what is this process that you are following when it comes to appointing people to be on boards and when it comes to appointing people, and what's driving your thinking and your rationale around that. So a number of these mistakes tend to happen at that particular level. Then you hear there's too much interference. Then you hear minister is getting involved in operations. you hear the boards themselves are getting involved in operations, and then you end up having a mess of a situation. But if we rebase, we go back, we take a step back and we say, this is the way that is very clear in which we want to do governance. This is the way which is going to be very clear that we want to do selection, recruitment, and retention, and performance management, and all the elements that go with that. And this is how we're going to articulate the issues of culture and values, because I will tell you now, every time you don't look after culture and values in any organization, you're actually asking for trouble. I can sit down here. I actually don't know what the values are at Eskom and what is the culture at Eskom, but you see so many things that are happening all the time, and we don't even understand whether this one minister is going to have the same interpretation as the next minister. You have two ministers disagreeing on exactly the same thing. That is a reflection of a lot of the dissonance that arises because there is no template on which we're actually operating. So the problems will continue to happen, even if we sit down now. This board that is there that Mr. Matabane says is very good, they will tap them out in another 2 years because there's a problem. They'll bring another CEO, and every time we'll continue to go back because we're not actually dealing with the real issue. And that issue, as I said, it starts at the top. Is cabinet itself adequate to be able to deal with these particular issues? Do they have the level of experience, or can they rely on the level of expertise that they need to be able to do to hire and appoint board members? And therefore, when you then have the board members, what is the governance structure that says CEOs look after operations, boards, they do supervision, and they look after the things and the components that are very relevant to what they do?
Well, we've been waiting for a cabinet reshuffle for quite a while, and we know for a fact that once that gets done, eventually, it will be a function of, the politics of the day. He's going to look at his NEC. He's going to look at the ministers he already has. Remember, he's just survived what was a big battle, at Nasrec. So he needs to make sure that he's got the right people next to him. And the right people may not necessarily be the right people to occupy the positions that he's going to give them. That is the fact, and that's what's going to happen.
In fact, I think we are where we are precisely because of cadre deployment, because we are not palliating, highlighting, and celebrating merit, but rewarding loyalty. We are exactly where we are now precisely because we don't have a heightened sense of agency. We're busy fiddling while Rome is burning. Everything that could possibly go wrong about this country has indeed gone wrong. And yet we're acting as if more is noch adag. You talk about the State of the Nation address. The president spoke about 8 themes. If I talk about only 3 actions that he promised South Africans, one was the declaration of the national state of disaster. I mean, this is extraordinary means that you are taking. From then up until now, nothing has been done to put this into place. Number 2, we spoke about the Minister of Electricity. I agree with Ntate Khanki Mataban to say, but that's not our problem. But that's what you promised. It's almost 3 weeks later, there is no Minister of Electricity. But what we did hear from the Minister of Finance in the budget speech is that we don't have a budget for this. It shows that there is not only a disjuncture, but people are working at cross purposes, because a budget in business is simply a financial language as to how to execute on the strategy. Your boss tells you what the strategy is, you go and find the money. It's not your job to tell your boss that I don't have the money. Lastly, it's about fixing the more than 734 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies. But if you look at the effect of stage 6 load shedding, it has been devastating to the economy in general, to you and I, because the cost at stage 6 is 6 billion a day. 4 to 6 billion a day. Between stages is 500 million. In fact, the Minister of Energy, together with NERSA, are measuring the cost of unserved electricity. When you look at that number, it says just in 2022, we had 6,400 kilowatt hours of unserved electricity. At 85 rand per kilowatt, the loss to the economy is 560 billion. So if you are a big company like Netcare, your profits are reduced by 530 million rand because of what you have spent just on the cost of diesel. They don't tell us how much they've had to put in as capital outlay in buying these generators. But if you are a small butcher and you are a small bakery, first, you don't have the money to buy a Cummins 43 kilowatt generator with 125 liters at 20 rand per liter of diesel. So, in fact, if you were just to spend your money on diesel, the cost is 8.5 times the cost per hour of electricity. Therefore, it simply pushes you into absolute bankruptcy. Ndate Matabane, when he started, he said, to address the issue of the stubbornly high levels of unemployment, we are looking at small and medium enterprises where jobs are created in large numbers. But in fact, in COVID and now during load shedding, the businesses that we are killing in great numbers, it's small and medium enterprises.
Now, here's something that the president said in his State of the Nation address. I want to end it here because so that we can begin to talk about the role of business on the back, of course, of comments that have been made recently that business is not really coming to the party, and so on and so forth. But take a listen to what the president had to say in his State of the Nation address about what's working and the role that business has actually been playing in some of the successes, he says, we've been able to see.
We are pleased that the social partners, particularly business, has been providing support to implement the Energy Action Plan in the spirit of social compacting. Similarly, we have developed a close working relationship with both labor and community-based organizations in supporting other aspects of the energy crisis response. Just as energy is essential for economic growth, so is another important area of South African life, a reliable water supply and efficient transport and road infrastructure system.
Of course, I mean, a year after we were promised a social compact, within or in about 100 days, we still don't have it, Mr. Matabane.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to have it anytime soon, mainly because we had a meeting with the president where there was an agreement that there will be bilaterals between business and government. There were even ministers who were selected to meet with us. But the next we hear is that we must have a meeting with labor and community and government, and I think that is what contributes to the trust deficit. That commitments are made where we could be sitting together as business and government and coming up with the clear implementable plans, and all of a sudden there's a meeting that involves other players who may be contributing different things or even contrary to what we're trying to do. So I don't think there's going to be any agreement on that anytime soon. But I think again is that the challenge is that those then are converted into talk shops. And the business people, as you may know, they are running businesses. They don't necessarily have much time to be talking infinitely. So some of them then decide, no, maybe we shouldn't be involved here. So our appeal again is that when there's an agreement on something, to say it's going to be done in the next 2 months, let it be done the way it has been agreed, and it will help us to move forward with progress. Because the challenge that we have, we don't have a challenge of meeting ministers or meeting the president. The challenge is just on the commitments that are made. We don't see any implementation that will move a dial. And that is, I think, one thing that we need to deal with so that we can deal with the deficit, the confidence deficit and trust deficit that we have.
It was the president himself, Mr. Mukogi, who underscored the importance of a social compact, because all of you are going to get into conversations about what needs to be done, what each one of the social partners is bringing to the table, what it is that you are going to sacrifice for the sake of the greater good and so on. And I had economists here on the program talking about the value, of having this social compact and what the experience has been, across the world, and how useful they actually are, especially given the nature of the challenges that we're seeing in our own country. But I'm disturbed by Mr. Matabane saying, we're not going to see this. The reality is that we're not going to see this anytime soon.
Well, I think that we have to try and continue the engagement. The engagement cannot stop, and we have to continue to do that. Of course, the president still needs to act, and he still needs to, him and his ministers, they need to deliver on the program that they have actually promised South Africa. So a lot of these things are things that, of course, someone is responsible for, and they need to have the accountability and the responsibility. Sometimes a lot of these consultations, and President Ramaphosa is sometimes criticized for over-consulting and not necessarily getting to the execution stage. And I also myself don't think that much is going to be achieved very soon in terms of those particular processes around putting together a social compact, because we don't even agree on what that particular agenda ought to be. In other words, first you need to have an agenda. We need to agree on what is the plan that we all agree on. At this particular point in time, there's too much dissonance, too much disagreement. Business itself does not actually, at this particular point in time, would be pretending if we said they speak with one voice. There are seriously big issues that still need to be resolved, even amongst business formations themselves. The issue around land needs to be resolved. The issue around PE, transformation, once empowered, always empowered. All those particular pieces of transformative action, they need to be resolved. So we do need to have this particular engagement where we have finally got to agree and say, where are we actually taking South Africa? The vision for South Africa is shared equally between what business sees and what government sees and what other social partners actually see. What is our strategy when it relates to what we want to do around Africa, because we are an African state. And do we ever think ourselves as an African state? Do we see our growth markets there? If we do, what exactly is the plan around that? So if you compare us with either the Chinese, the Indians, and the Brazilians, we are very, very far behind in terms of having a very clear plan of a national agenda about how we want to engage the external world, because we're caught up too much in our own domestic and internal fights about things that we ought to be able to resolve. I think that the issue of transformation is very simple and straightforward, yet we don't agree. And I don't think that we as business ourselves are being honest sometimes when we put a lot of pressure on government, but we're not resolving this particular piece ourselves in terms of where do we stand, how do we wish to make this very sustainable contribution in terms of moving South Africa forward in a way when we talk about inclusive economic growth and job creation. So all these matters are matters that need to actually resolve. And until we get our house in order, I don't think that will actually make much of an impact in the external world. So we are where we are, and we're always willing and able to engage with government, engage with the president. And I think that my colleagues are quite correct that you don't see that as almost a seriousness. There are a few people that maybe government prefers to talk to, but they are not always going to talk to everybody else, and that sometimes creates this level of frustration.
Oh, but what Mr. Mukoki just said, Professor Mohale, reminds me that your organization is called Business Unity South Africa. One assumes that unity is the one thing that you value and something that you'd be keen to promote. Just on the back of what the things he said about the fact that business itself is not speaking in one voice. There are so many unresolved issues, which would then make it difficult to then go as a block, when you are engaging with your, organized labor, business, the government and the community.
Ntate Mukoki and Ntate Matabane are absolutely correct. But remember that Business Unity South Africa was a creation by all of us, 127 organizations that went to Skukuza under the leadership of President Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela, who gave us the leader of business Thabo Mbeki to say, I have 222 working days in a year. If I consult with all of you, I won't have time to talk to anybody else. That's how BUSA was created. We also know why the BMF, under the leadership of Mzwanele Chimibanye, then pulled out of BUSA at that time, and then followed by 26 other black organizations to create the Black Business Council, which we should never have wound down in the first place. But, you know, hindsight is a perfect science. But let me just address the issue of the social compact. We have signed social compacts with this government before. And in fact, what is required in terms of commitments, when you think about it theoretically, is not very complex. Because the government has to commit to a few things: to stop state capture, corruption, bribery, stealing and cheating, to focus on service delivery, to continue creating a conducive environment in which business can thrive, provide regulatory certainty and policy stability. It gives business an opportunity to come and make certain commitments. One of them is itself to stop aiding and abetting state capture, because some of our own were called out by names during the Zondo Commission. But also, business must continue to invest, especially in infrastructure. Business must be committed to transformation, like paying small and medium enterprises in 30 days. I mean, that's not much to ask. And implement programs like gender equality and pay parity. We don't need government permission to be able to do that. So that we give labor an opportunity to say, you know what, for the next 5 years, we are going to stop going on strikes at the drop of a hat, and we are going to stop demanding double-digit salary increases, but that we are going to make commitments to improvements in productivity, because in the last study that was done, out of 60 countries, South Africa came stone last as number 60 in terms of productivity. So these conversations need to be had so that we leave space for community to come and say, we are going to execute on our mandate to be a good corporate citizen. So when you go back to why this is not happening, you can only put it down to lack of leadership, because we met, all of us, on the 28th of January with the president, and as business we committed to do 6 things, and then the president hasn't even sat down with all of us to say, what are you committing to? Because a social compact is not coming to the table to see what is it that you can get from that table. It's coming prepared to give up something.
In fact, I've got less than a minute, and what Professor Mohale just said, Mr. Mokoki and Mr. Matabane, was something he said the last time we were here. He was here and we're talking about this social compacting and why things were not moving. In just 30 seconds, 15 seconds each, I want to ask you whether you believe what he believes, that a big part of the problem, the reason we are not where we should be, is because there's of the government's refusal, government in particular's refusal to lead. Yes? No, Mr. Matabane?
Let me just give you an example. This year we were 20 years.
And we don't have time.
We're supposed to celebrate 20 years of them.
Do you agree that the government's lack a refusal or parent refusal to lead is a big part of this problem? It's why we're here.
Yes, I think it's lack of implementation of decisions.
Mr. Ogogi?
I wouldn't call it a refusal, but I would think it's lack of appreciation, largely based on maybe not even understanding what it is that needs to be done. But I wouldn't think that there are people sitting there refusing. I think that they just don't know what to do.
Gentlemen, let me thank you very much for coming on this evening. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, that's our show for tonight. So join us again tomorrow evening, same time. Have a good night.